Hey guys, enjoy these new 20 stories. We hope you enjoy them. Let us know your thoughts. And as always, most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button too. It's free and does so much for us. We're forever grateful. Now to the stories.
Everything seemed normal at first, but then the photos started appearing. It was textbook rom-com stuff at the beginning. I met Daniel at a friend's birthday party. He was charming, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. He was a graphic designer with a quirky sense of humor and a kind smile. We bonded over our shared love of old movies and indie music, and by the end of the night, I was completely smitten. Our first few dates were like scenes from a movie. We went to art galleries, had picnics in the park, and stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. He was attentive, thoughtful, and made me feel like I was the only girl in the world. My friends were even jealous. He seems too good to be true, my best friend Chloe said one night over wine. I laughed it off, telling her she was just being cynical, but deep down, a tiny part of me wondered if she was right. Things started to shift subtly after a couple of months. Daniel became more possessive, wanting to know where I was at all times and who I was with. He started showing up unexpectedly at my work, claiming he wanted to surprise me with lunch. It was sweet at first, but then it started feeling like he was checking up on me. He also began criticizing my friends, saying they were a bad influence and didn't understand our relationship. I started seeing them less, not wanting to cause conflict. I wrote out my concerns, telling myself he was just protective. He kept reassuring me that all of that was how much he cared about me. Then came the social media posts. He would tag me in posts, usually song lyrics or poems that were overly romantic and a little intense. He started posting pictures of us, lots of them, without asking me first. I didn't mind the occasional photo, but it felt like he was documenting every moment of our lives for the world to see. I tried to talk to him about it, telling him I valued my privacy and didn't want our relationship to be plastered all over the internet. He dismissed my concerns, saying I was being too sensitive and that he just wanted to show the world how much he loved me. I didn't push it, not wanting to start an argument. Then one morning, I woke up to a message from an unknown number. It was a picture of me sleeping in my bed. The photo was taken from across the street, through my bedroom window. My heart stopped. I sat bolt upright in bed, my mind racing. How could anyone have taken that picture? I lived on the second floor of an apartment building. It would have been impossible to get that angle without being seen. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every sound. I kept replaying the message, trying to make sense of it. Who sent it? And why? I couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt me. Maybe it was some kind of sick prank. I told Daniel about the picture, hoping he could offer some reassurance. He was surprisingly calm, almost dismissive. He said it was probably just a random creep and that I shouldn't worry about it. He said I was being paranoid and that someone should try to get my reaction. His reaction didn't feel genuine. He was too calm. But then the other photos started appearing. Pictures of me at work, walking down the street, having lunch with my friends. Each photo was taken from a distance without my knowledge. It was clear that someone was stalking me. I went to the police, but they said there was nothing they could do until the stalker made a direct threat. They advised me to be careful and to report any suspicious activity. But the activity that was going on was hard to describe. I just knew I was being watched and something didn't feel right with Daniel. I became a prisoner in my own home, afraid to go outside. I covered my windows with blankets, turning my apartment into a dark, claustrophobic space. I stopped going to work, called in sick, too scared to leave. I tried to confide in Daniel, but he seemed increasingly distant, almost annoyed by my fear. He said I was letting my imagination run wild and that I was ruining our relationship with my paranoia. I didn't feel supported by Daniel. One night, I was scrolling through Daniel's Instagram feed when I noticed something strange. He had posted a picture of a building that looked suspiciously like my apartment building. The caption read, "Watching over you." My blood ran cold. I clicked on the location tag, and it confirmed my worst fears. The picture was taken from directly across the street from my apartment. And with further investigation, it seemed Daniel was using a second account to send me the photos. I was being stalked, but by Daniel. I confronted him immediately, showing him the picture and demanding an explanation. He didn't deny it. He just stared at me with a blank expression. "I was just trying to protect you," he said, his voice flat. The world is a dangerous place. I wanted to make sure you were safe. By stalking me, I screamed, my voice trembling. By taking pictures of me without my knowledge. By making me feel like I'm going crazy. He didn't respond. He just stood there watching me, his eyes empty. I knew I had to get out of there. I ran to the door, but he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice now menacing. I struggled, trying to break free, but he held on tight. He started dragging me towards the bedroom, his eyes fixated on me. I was terrified, convinced that he was going to hurt me. But I'd had enough of the torture. I kicked him and ran out the door. I ran out into the street, screaming for help. A neighbor heard my cries and called the police. When they arrived, they found Daniel inside my apartment, surrounded by photos of me. He was arrested and charged with stalking and harassment. It's been several years since that night, and I'm still haunted by what happened. I moved to a new city, changed my name, and started therapy. I'm still afraid of getting close to anyone, terrified of repeating the same mistakes. I should have been listening to Chloe about Daniel. He had an oddness about him. Daniel was a good manipulator. Daniel was a scary individual. I'll never forget Daniel and everything I went through because of him. It's a reminder to always trust your instincts and to never ignore the red flags, no matter how charming someone may seem. Because sometimes the person you think you know best is the one you should fear the most. The scariest part is that this really happened. It's not some urban legend or a made-up story for a podcast. This happened to me, and it still gives me chills to think about. It started like any other online dating story. I was bored, lonely, and swiping through profiles on a dating app late one night when I came across Kane's profile. He seemed like a normal guy. His profile picture showed him smiling at the camera with a dog at his feet. He said he was a teacher, loved to read, and enjoyed hiking. His messages were polite and engaging, not overly flirty or pushy. After a week of chatting, we decided to meet for coffee. The coffee date went well. Kane was charming, intelligent, and easy to talk to. We talked about our jobs, our families, and our hobbies. There were no red flags, no weird vibes, just a genuinely pleasant conversation. We even made plans for a second date, a picnic in the park. The picnic date was even better than the first. The weather was perfect, the food was delicious, and Daniel was his usual charming self. We laughed, we talked, and we even held hands as we walked through the park. By the end of the date, I was starting to feel like I might have actually met someone special. That's when things started to get strange. A few days after the picnic, Kane started texting me more frequently, sometimes multiple times an hour. At first, it was sweet, but it quickly became overwhelming. He would ask what I was doing, who I was with, and when I would be free to see him again. If I didn't respond immediately, he would start sending me worried messages, asking if I was okay. I tried to gently tell him that I needed some space, that I couldn't be available 24/7, but he didn't seem to understand. He would apologize and promise to give me more space, but then the behavior would just start up again. One evening, I was at home watching TV when I received a text from Kane. Outside, it read. I was confused. I hadn't invited him over, and we hadn't made any plans. "What do you mean you're outside?" I texted back. "I wanted to surprise you," he replied. "Come on out." I hesitated. I didn't want to see him, but I also didn't want to cause a scene. I decided to go outside and politely tell him that I needed some space. When I opened my front door, Kane was standing on my porch, holding a bouquet of flowers. He smiled when he saw me. "Surprise," he said. I forced a smile and took the flowers. "Kane, this is really sweet, but I told you I needed some space," I said. His smile faded. "I miss you," he said. "I just wanted to see you for a few minutes." "I can't, Kane," I said. "I'm busy. I need you to leave." He didn't move. "Please," he begged. "Just 5 minutes. That's all I ask." I was starting to get uncomfortable. His eyes were wide and pleading, and his voice was trembling. "Kane, you're scaring me," I said. "I need you to go." Finally, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, relieved that the situation had been diffused. I went inside, locked the door, and turned off all the lights. I wasn't in the mood to do anything. But that was only the beginning. The next day, I started receiving strange phone calls. The caller ID showed an unknown number. When I answered, there was only silence on the other end. After the fifth or sixth call, I blocked the number. Then came the emails, dozens of them, all from different anonymous accounts. They contained poems, love letters, and sometimes disturbing images. I deleted them all without reading them. I started to feel like I was being watched. I would catch glimpses of someone following me when I was walking down the street. I would hear noises outside my apartment at night. I was constantly on edge. One evening, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. My heart leaped into my throat. I cautiously pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was empty, but it was clear that someone had been there. My belongings had been rifled through, and there was a strange smell in the air. On my bathroom mirror, someone had written in lipstick, "I'm always watching you." I ran out of the apartment and called the police. They came and took a report, but they said there wasn't much they could do without any evidence. I was terrified. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. I knew that Kane was behind it all, but I had no proof. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed security cameras in my apartment and started carrying pepper spray with me everywhere I went. I also changed my phone number and email address. A few weeks went by without any incidents. I started to think that maybe Kane had finally given up, but I was wrong. One night, I was awakened by a loud banging on my front door. I looked at the security camera feed on my phone and saw Kane standing outside, his face contorted with rage. He was holding a crowbar. I called 911 and hid in my bedroom closet, clutching a knife. I could hear Kane smashing through the door and ransacking my apartment. He was screaming my name, his voice filled with hatred. The police arrived just as Kane was about to break down my bedroom door. They arrested him and took him into custody. I later learned that Kane had a history of stalking and harassment. He had been obsessed with other women in the past and had even served time in jail for stalking. I was lucky to escape with my life. I moved to a new city, changed my name, and started therapy. I still have nightmares about Kane, but I'm slowly starting to heal. The scariest part is that this really happened. It's a reminder that you never really know who someone is, even if they seem normal on the surface. It's so easy to trust others, so be safe and be smart. This happened to me a few months ago, and honestly, I'm still trying to process it. I mean, you hear about dating app horror stories all the time, but you never really think it'll happen to you. You swipe, you chat, you maybe meet for a drink, and that's usually the end of it. But this was different. My name's Liam, and I'm a graphic designer. I've been single for a while and decided to give Bumble a try. Swiping around, I matched with a woman named Serafina. Her profile was intriguing, artsy photos, a witty bio, and a shared love for obscure indie films. We started chatting, and I was immediately drawn to her intelligence and her offbeat sense of humor. We talked for a couple of weeks, and the conversation flowed easily. She seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, and I felt the same way about her. We decided to meet up for a date at a local art gallery. I was actually excited, which is rare for me. The gallery was dimly lit and filled with bizarre sculptures and abstract paintings. Serafina was already there when I arrived, and she was even more striking in person than in her photos. She had long, dark hair, piercing green eyes, and a captivating smile. She was wearing a vintage dress and a pair of Doc Martens, which I thought was pretty cool. We spent the next few hours wandering through the gallery, discussing the art and sharing our thoughts and feelings. Serafina was incredibly insightful and articulate, and I found myself completely engrossed in her conversation. She had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. After the gallery, we went to a nearby bar for drinks. We talked about everything from our families to our dreams for the future. Serafina was open and honest about her life, and I felt like I could be myself around her. We laughed, we flirted, and we even shared a few awkward but sweet moments of silence. As the night drew to a close, I walked Serafina back to her apartment. It was in an old Victorian building on the edge of downtown. The street was dark and quiet, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. We stood on her doorstep for a moment, looking at each other. "I had a really great time tonight, Liam," she said, her voice soft. "Me too, Serafina," I replied, smiling. "I'd love to do it again sometime." "I like that," she said, and then she leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was electric. It was passionate and tender, and it left me wanting more. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless. "Good night, Liam," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Good night, Serafina," I replied. I watched as she unlocked her door and disappeared inside. I walked home that night with a huge smile on my face. I couldn't stop thinking about Serafina. I felt like I had finally met someone truly special. I texted her when I got home, telling her how much I enjoyed the date and that I couldn't wait to see her again. She texted back almost immediately, saying she felt the same way. We made plans to go out again the following weekend. I was counting down the days, but then, a few days later, things started to get weird. I started receiving strange texts from Serafina. They were cryptic and unsettling, filled with references to ancient rituals and occult symbols. At first, I thought she was just joking around, but the text became increasingly bizarre and disturbing. She started sending me photos of strange symbols drawn in blood and videos of herself chanting in a language I didn't understand. I tried to talk to her about it, but she just brushed it off, saying I wouldn't understand. I was starting to get really worried. I didn't know what was going on with her, but it was clear that something was wrong. I considered calling her friends or family, but I didn't know anyone who knew her. I felt trapped and helpless. Then, one night, I received a text from Serafina that sent shivers down my spine. It was a picture of me, taken through my bedroom window. The text read, "I'm watching you, Liam." I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How did she know where I lived? How did she get that picture? I ran to my window and looked outside, but I didn't see anyone. I slammed the curtains shut and locked all the doors and windows. I was terrified. I felt like I was being stalked, and I didn't know who to turn to. I called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They took my statement and told me to be careful, but they couldn't offer any real protection. I was on my own. I spent the next few days living in a state of constant fear. I barely slept. I jumped at every sound. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that Serafina was watching me. I started seeing her everywhere, in the shadows, in the reflections in my dreams. Then one night, I woke up to find her standing in my bedroom. She was wearing a long black robe, and her eyes were glowing with an eerie light. She was holding a knife in her hand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear. "It's time, Liam," she said, her voice cold and emotionless. "Time for what?" I managed to stammer. "Time for the ritual," she replied. "You can chosen." And that's when I passed out. I woke up the next morning in my bed alone. The sun was shining, and the birds were singing. It was like the previous night had been a nightmare. But then I saw it, a strange symbol carved into my chest. I don't know what happened that night, and I didn't want to know. I moved out of my apartment and changed my number. I'm still looking over my shoulder, but I haven't seen Serafina since. I'm getting help and will have the carving removed. I'll never use a dating app again. Some matches aren't worth it. I keep replaying this nightmare in my head, trying to make sense of it, trying to find some kind of rational explanation. But there isn't one. It's just wrong. It was supposed to be a normal date. Dinner and a movie, nothing fancy. I met him online. His profile was charming, funny, with just the right amount of self-deprecation. We chatted for a couple of weeks, and he seemed genuinely nice. Maybe a little quirky, but not in a bad way. More like an endearing, awkward kind of way. His name was David. We decided to meet at a local Italian restaurant. I got there first and was already seated when he arrived. He was taller than I expected, and a little bit thinner. His eyes were a very pale blue, almost silver, which I hadn't noticed in his photos. He apologized for being late, explaining that he'd had trouble finding parking. We ordered drinks and started making small talk. The first hour was perfectly normal. We talked about our jobs, our hobbies, our favorite movies. He was a good listener, asking questions and genuinely seeming interested in what I had to say. He was a little intense, maybe, staring at me a little too intently, but I chalked it up to him being nervous. Then the conversation took a turn. He started asking me about my dreams, not the career-oriented kind, but the actual dreams I had when I was sleeping. He wanted to know every detail, every image, every feeling. It was a little odd, but I'm a pretty open person, so I indulged him. I told him about the recurring dream I had where I'm falling endlessly through a dark void, and the one where I'm back in my childhood home, but everything is distorted and unsettling. He listened intently, his silver eyes fixed on me, not blinking. When I finished, he smiled, a strange, unsettling smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Interesting," he said, his voice low and almost hypnotic. Dreams are portals, windows into other worlds. I laughed nervously. Okay, Dave Villo out there, aren't we? He didn't laugh. He just kept staring at me. I'm serious. Dreams are more real than you think. They can be manipulated. I tried to steer the conversation back to something lighter, but he wouldn't let it go. He kept talking about dreams, about alternate realities, about the power of the subconscious mind. He started saying things that didn't make any sense, using words I didn't understand. It was like he was speaking another language. I started feeling incredibly uncomfortable. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to be rude. I kept hoping he would snap out of it and the date would get back to normal. But it didn't. It just got weirder and weirder. Then he reached across the table and took my hand. His hand was cold, clammy, and his grip was surprisingly strong. "Let me show you something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Let me show you what's real." I tried to pull my hand away, but he wouldn't let go. He closed his eyes and started muttering something under his breath. His grip tightened, and I started to feel a strange, tingling sensation in my arm. The restaurant seemed to fade away, the sounds of clattering silverware and chattering voices dissolving into a dull hum. Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. It could have been seconds. It could have been hours. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in a restaurant anymore. I was standing in a forest. It wasn't like any forest I'd ever seen before. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with a heavy, cloying scent like rotting flowers and damp earth. The ground was soft and spongy under my feet. The sky was a sickly shade of green, casting an eerie glow over everything. I was alone. David was nowhere to be seen. I started walking, desperately trying to find my way out of the forest, but the trees were so dense that I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless labyrinth of twisted trees and strange shadows. As I walked deeper into the forest, I started hearing things. Whispers, moans, rustling sounds in the underbrush. It felt like I was being watched, stalked by something unseen. The feeling of unease I had felt in the restaurant intensified into pure, unadulterated terror. Then I saw them. They were standing among the trees, their bodies pale and emaciated, their eyes hollow and black. They were dressed in tattered rags, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and despair. They reached out to me with their skeletal hands, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the lost souls of the forest. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the screams of the lost souls echoing in my ears. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached, until I couldn't run anymore. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, convinced that I was going to die there alone in that horrible place. Then everything went black again. When I woke up, I was back in the restaurant. David was still sitting across from me, his silver eyes fixed on me. He was smiling that same unsettling smile. "Welcome back," he said, his voice smooth and seductive. "Did you enjoy your little trip?" I stared at him in horror, unable to speak. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from him, but I was paralyzed with fear. I thought I was being paranoid until the pictures started showing up. It had all seemed so normal at first, just a series of mildly awkward, slightly endearing encounters that slowly morphed into something deeply unsettling. I'd met David at a coffee shop, a chance encounter while waiting in line. He was tall, with kind eyes and a nervous laugh that I found strangely charming. We talked for a while, exchanged numbers, and agreed to go out sometime. Our first few dates were textbook perfect. Dinner at a cozy Italian restaurant, a walk in the park, a movie night at my place. David was attentive, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. He remembered small details from our conversations, asked thoughtful questions, and always made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Looking back, that's probably the first red flag I ignored. It was too perfect. No one is that attentive without a hidden motive, right? It was after about a month of dating that things started to feel off. Subtle things at first. David would show up at my apartment unannounced, saying he was in the neighborhood or just wanted to surprise me. He started calling and texting constantly, sometimes multiple times an hour. I chalked it up to him being smitten, a little overeager, but nothing to be seriously concerned about. Then came the questions. increasingly personal, probing questions about my past, my friends, my family. He wanted to know everything, down to the smallest details. He asked all my exes, pressing me for information about their personalities, their relationships with me, and even their current whereabouts. It felt less like curiosity and more like an interrogation. I started to feel like I was being analyzed, dissected, categorized. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being overly sensitive, that David was just a little insecure. But my gut kept telling me something was wrong. One evening, I mentioned a casual get-together with some friends from college. David's face clouded over. He pressed me for details, wanting to know who would be there, what we would be doing, and what time I would be home. When I hesitated, he became visibly agitated, accusing me of being secretive and untrustworthy. I ended up canceling my plans just to avoid a fight. That was the first time I realized that this wasn't just awkwardness or insecurity. It was control. The gaslighting started soon after. David would deny things he had said or done, twist my words, and make me feel like I was losing my mind. He'd apologize profusely after an outburst, showering me with affection and promises to change, only to repeat the same behavior a few days later. I started to question my own memory, my own perceptions. Was I really overreacting? Was I being unfair to him? Then one morning, I woke up to a text message from an unknown number. It was a picture of me sitting in a cafe a few days earlier. I hadn't noticed anyone taking my picture. It was just me enjoying a quiet moment with a book. But there it was, undeniable proof that I was being watched. I panicked. I showed the picture to David, trying to gauge his reaction. He feigned concern, suggesting it was probably just a random tourist. But I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a brief moment of triumph that he quickly masked. The pictures kept coming. Photos of me leaving my apartment, walking to work, shopping at the grocery store. Each one more unsettling than the last. They were always taken from a distance, often from strange angles, as if someone was lurking in the shadows. I felt like I was living in a horror movie, constantly looking over my shoulder, never knowing who was watching or what they were planning. I went to the police, but they couldn't do much without concrete evidence. Stalking laws are tricky, and the pictures, while disturbing, weren't enough to justify an arrest. They advised me to get a restraining order, but I knew that wouldn't stop David. It would only escalate things. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. I changed my route to work, varied my routine, and tried to avoid being alone whenever possible. I felt like a prisoner in my own life. The final straw came when I found a picture of my parents' house. It was a clear, high-resolution image taken from across the street. A direct threat. He knew where my family lived. That's when I knew I had to get out. I couldn't reason with him, couldn't appease him. I had to disappear. I packed a bag, withdrew all the money from my bank account, and left a note for my landlord, explaining that I had to leave for a family emergency. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I just vanished. I spent the next few months moving from place to place, staying in cheap motels and Airbnbs, always looking over my shoulder. I changed my name, got a new phone number, and deleted all my social media accounts. I became a ghost, erasing myself from the digital world. Eventually, I settled in a small town in a different state, far away from everything I knew. I found a new job, made a few friends, and started to rebuild my life. But the fear never really goes away. I still have nightmares about David, about the pictures, about the feeling of being watched. I still check my locks multiple times before bed, and I'm always wary of new people. I thought I was being paranoid, that I was exaggerating the situation, but I wasn't. David was a predator, a master manipulator who slowly, methodically tried to control my life. I got out, but I'll never be the same. And I'll never trust someone so completely, so quickly again. The scars of that experience run deep, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most charming smile. I never thought this would happen to me, but now I understand why people always say to trust your instincts, even when everything seems perfect on the surface. This happened a few years ago when I was living in a new city and actively trying to expand my social circle. I joined a few online groups, attended some meetups, and even tried my hand at online dating. That's how I met Julian. Julian was different from anyone I dated before. He was worldly, sophisticated, and incredibly charming. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, like your thoughts and opinions were the most important things in the world. He was also incredibly handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a confident smile that could melt glaciers. We met on a dating app that catered to people interested in art and culture. His profile was filled with photos of him at museums, art galleries, and classical music concerts. He claimed to be a freelance writer and photographer, traveling the world and documenting his experiences. It all sounded incredibly glamorous and exciting, and I was immediately drawn in. Our first date was at a trendy wine bar downtown. He arrived early, holding a bouquet of my favorite flowers. He complimented my dress, my hair, my intellect. He asked thoughtful questions about my life and listened intently to my answers. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and I felt I'd known him forever. Over the next few weeks, we went on a series of amazing dates. We explored hidden art galleries, attended live music performances, and even took a weekend trip to a nearby coastal town. He was always so attentive, so generous, so perfect. I couldn't believe my luck. I thought I'd finally found someone who truly understood me, someone who shared my passions and values. But then subtle cracks started to appear in his carefully constructed facade. He became increasingly secretive about his work, refusing to show me any of his writing or photography. He always had an excuse, a non-disclosure agreement, a client's privacy, a project that was too raw to share. He also started borrowing money from me, small amounts at first, but then larger and larger sums. He always promised to pay me back, but the money never materialized. He also had a tendency to disappear for days at a time, claiming to be on assignment in remote locations with limited cell service. When he returned, he'd be full of stories about his adventures, but they always sounded a little too fantastical, a little too rehearsed. Despite these warning signs, I was blinded by my infatuation with him. I wanted to believe that he was the person I thought he was, that our connection was real. I ignored my instincts, rationalizing his behavior and making excuses for his lies. Then one evening, I received a strange message from an unknown number. It was a single sentence: "Look into Julian's past." The message sent a chill down my spine. I tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as a prank, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I started with a simple Google search, typing in Julian's name. The results were shocking. There were several articles about a man named Julian, but not the charming writer and photographer I thought I knew. This Julian was a con artist, a swindler who had been preying on women for years. He would charm them, gain their trust, and then bleed them dry financially, leaving them emotionally devastated. The articles included photos of him, and there was no doubt it was the same Julian I was dating. The details of his scams were chillingly similar to my own experience. The fake job, the borrowed money, the disappearing acts have all added up. I felt sick to my stomach. I'd been completely duped, manipulated by a professional liar. I was angry, hurt, and terrified. What else was he lying about? What were his true intentions? I immediately blocked his number and deactivated my social media accounts. I changed my locks and installed a security system in my apartment. I was afraid he would come after me, that he would try to retaliate for exposing him. I went to the police and reported him, but they said there was little they could do without more evidence. They advised me to stay away from him and to contact them immediately if he tried to contact me. I never heard from Julian again. I don't know where he went or who his next victim was, but I hope he's brought to justice someday. The experience was traumatic, to say the least. It shattered my trust in people and left me with a deep sense of vulnerability. It took me a long time to recover, to rebuild my confidence, and to open myself up to the possibility of love again. Now I'm much more cautious, much more discerning. I trust my instincts, even when they're telling me something I don't want to hear. I've learned that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the most charming people are the ones you need to be the most wary of. I never thought this would happen to me, but now I know that anyone can be a victim of deception, no matter how smart or careful they are. The key is to trust your gut, to recognize the red flags, and to walk away before it's too late. It isn't the end for me. There is hope. I wish I could forget what happened that day, the day I decided to give Felix a second chance. I know. Second chances are supposed to be a good thing, a testament to forgiveness and growth. But some people, some situations, they're just not meant to be revisited. Felix was one of those. We met at a gallery opening. He was tall, with piercing blue eyes and a charmingly awkward smile. He talked about art and philosophy, and for a brief moment, I thought I'd stumbled upon someone genuinely interesting. Our first date was equally promising. We went to a small Italian restaurant, shared a bottle of wine, and talked for hours. He seemed attentive, intelligent, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. Then came the second date. It started off normally enough, a walk through the park, holding hands, light conversation. But as the day wore on, things started to shift. He became more intense, more possessive. He started asking probing questions about my past relationships, my family, my deepest insecurities. He wanted to know everything, and he wanted to know it now. I started to feel uncomfortable, like I was being interrogated rather than courted. When I tried to change the subject, he would steer it back to me, back to my life, back to my secrets. He was like a black hole, sucking in all my energy and leaving me feeling drained and exposed. By the end of the date, I was exhausted and completely turned off. I politely told him that I didn't think we were a good match and that I didn't want to see him again. He didn't take it well. He pleaded, he begged, he even cried. He said he was sorry if he came on too strong, that he just really liked me and didn't want to mess things up. He promised to change, to be more relaxed, to give me space. Against my better judgment, I agreed to give him one more chance. One more date, that was it. I wish I hadn't. He suggested we go hiking. He knew I loved hiking, and he said he had a great trail in mind, one that was secluded and beautiful. Red flags everywhere, but I ignored them. I wanted to believe that he had changed, that he was capable of being the person I thought he was. The trail was indeed secluded, almost eerily so. We didn't see another soul the entire time. The beauty of the scenery was overshadowed by the growing sense of dread that was creeping over me. Felix was quiet, almost brooding. He didn't hold my hand, didn't make eye contact. He just walked ahead of me, his pace quick and determined. As we hiked deeper into the woods, the trail became steeper and more treacherous. The sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows. I started to feel uneasy, like we were being watched. I suggested we turn back, but Felix refused. He said we were almost there, that the view at the top was worth it. We finally reached the summit, a rocky outcropping overlooking a vast expanse of forest. The view was stunning, but I couldn't appreciate it. I was too busy feeling terrified. Felix stood at the edge of the cliff, staring out into the distance, his face unreadable. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Yes," I replied, my voice trembling. "But I think we should go now. It's getting dark." He turned to face me, and his eyes were different. They were wild, intense, almost manic. "I brought you here for a reason," he said, taking a step closer. "What do you mean?" I asked, backing away. "I wanted you to see this," he said, gesturing to the view. "To see how insignificant we are, how meaningless our lives are." "Felix, what are you talking about?" He laughed, a harsh, unsettling sound that echoed through the trees. "I'm talking about the truth," he said. "The truth that no one wants to admit. The truth that we're all just going to die anyway, so nothing really matters." I was terrified. I knew something was terribly wrong. "I think I should leave," I said, turning to walk away. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "Not until you understand." He pulled me closer to the edge of the cliff. I could feel the wind whipping around me, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. "Felix, please," I begged. "Don't do this." He stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and despair. "I loved you," he said. "I really did, but you rejected me. You made me feel like I wasn't good enough." "That's not true," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I just didn't think we were compatible." "Lies," he screamed. "All lies. You're just like all the others. You think you're better than me, but you're not. You're just a spoiled, privileged bitch who doesn't appreciate anything." He pushed me. I stumbled backwards, losing my footing. I gasped. I remember the feeling of falling. I wish I could forget what happened that day. The way my body slammed against the rocks below, the blinding pain, the sickening crunch of bones breaking, and his face staring down, no remorse, just emptiness. I don't remember how I got out. I just remember getting up and running until the pain caught up, and I found someone to help me. What happened to him? I don't know, but hopefully something bad. And I'll never give someone I was unsure about a second chance. I keep replaying this nightmare in my head, over and over, trying to make sense of it, trying to find the moment where I could have changed things. but the truth is, I don't think there was one. I think from the start, I was just a pawn in someone else's twisted game. It all started with a dog. I know, sounds innocent enough, right? I'd always wanted a dog, but my apartment didn't allow pets. So I started volunteering at the local animal shelter. That's where I met him. His name was Philip, and he was also a volunteer. He was tall, kind of lanky, with this gentle smile and eyes that seemed genuinely caring. He loved dogs as much as I did, and we bonded over our shared passion for rescuing animals. We started talking during our shifts, then grabbing coffee afterward. It felt easy and natural. He knew I wanted a dog, and he kept saying how great it would be if I could adopt one. He even started sending me pictures of dogs up for adoption, specifically ones that were supposedly good with apartments. Looking back, I wonder if he was testing me, seeing how far he could push me. After a few weeks, he told me about this dog he knew of. A small, abandoned terrier mix that had been found wandering near his house. He said it was a perfect apartment dog, quiet, well-behaved, and desperately in need of a home. He even offered to let me test drive the dog for a weekend to see if it was a good fit. I was thrilled. I went to his place on a Friday evening, excited to finally have a furry companion, even if just for a few days. His apartment was sparse. Minimal furniture, bare walls, almost sterile. He said he was a minimalist, but it felt more like he wasn't living there at all. The dog, a scruffy little thing, was adorable. I named her Peanut. Fit watched me play with her, his eyes fixed on me with this intensity that made me slightly uncomfortable. He kept saying how good I was with animals, how nurturing I seemed. I brushed it off, but the compliment fell off. That night, we ordered pizza and watched a movie. He kept his distance, which I appreciated. I wasn't sure how I felt about him yet, but I enjoyed his company. I fell asleep on the couch, Peanut curled up at my feet. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. A low, rhythmic thumping. I sat up, disoriented, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the hallway. I nudged Peanut, but she didn't stir. Usually she was alert and quick to bark at any noise, but she was completely unresponsive, like she was drugged. I grabbed my phone and cautiously made my way into the hallway. The thumping grew louder and more insistent. It was coming from a closed door at the end of the hall, a door I hadn't noticed before. I hesitated. I knew I shouldn't open it, but curiosity, that insatiable human flaw, got the better of me. I slowly reached for the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, lit only by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The thumping was deafening now. My eyes adjusted, and I saw the source. In the center of the room, suspended from the ceiling by chains, was a large metal cage. And inside the cage, pacing back and forth, was a man. A naked, emaciated man with wild eyes and matted hair. He was the one making the thumping sound, banging his body against the bars of the cage. I gasped, horror washing over me. My mind raced. Who was this man? What was he doing here? And what was Philip's role in all of this? Before I could process any of it, Philip appeared in the doorway behind me. He was smiling. But it wasn't the gentle, caring smile I'd come to know. This was a different smile. A cruel, predatory smile. "I see you found my little project," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I was wondering when you'd get curious." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. I couldn't find the words. "He's been a naughty boy," Philip continued, gesturing towards the caged man. "He didn't appreciate my hospitality, so he gets to stay in the cage until he learns his lesson." I stared at him, speechless, paralyzed with fear. He was insane, completely and utterly insane. "You see," Philip said, stepping closer, "I like to help people. I'd like to offer them a better life, but some people just don't appreciate it. They need to be taught." He reached out and touched my face, his fingers cold and clammy. I flinched, trying to pull away, but he held me firm. "I thought you were different," he said, his eyes boring into mine. "I thought you understood the value of kindness, but I guess I was wrong." He pushed me towards the cage. "Go ahead," he said. "Say hello. He's been wanting company." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. "Suit yourself," Philip said, shrugging. "More for me then." He turned towards the caged man and started taunting him, whispering things I couldn't understand. The caged man screamed, a primal, animalistic sound that sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there. I had to escape. I waited for the right moment when Philip was fully distracted by the cage man. Then I lunged. I shoved him hard, knocking him off balance, and sprinted towards the front door. He yelled after me, but I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, stumbling through the dark streets until I reached a gas station and called the police. They arrived quickly, sirens blaring. They stormed Philip's apartment, but it was empty. He was gone. The cage man was gone too. Peanut was there, still unresponsive, but otherwise the apartment was exactly as I had left it. The police launched a full-scale investigation, but they never found Philip or the cage man. They suspected he had fled the state, maybe even the country. I spent weeks in therapy trying to process what had happened. I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I still had nightmares about that night. About the cage man, about Philip's predatory smile, the feeling of utter helplessness. I never adopted a dog. I'm too afraid. I'm too afraid of trusting someone again, of letting someone into my life, of opening myself up to that kind of vulnerability. I keep replaying that nightmare in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't gone to Philip's apartment that night. If I hadn't been so desperate for a dog, if I had just trusted my instincts and stayed away. But the truth is, I'll never know. All I know is that I survived, and that I'll never forget the face of evil, masked by a gentle smile and a shared love for animals. He wasn't helping anyone. He had something wrong in his head. It was supposed to be a normal date, a casual meetup with a guy I'd matched with on Hinge. His name was Kyle, and his profile seemed pretty standard. Decent job, liked hiking, had a dog. We exchanged a few messages, and he seemed nice enough, if a little intense. He was very complimentary, calling me beautiful and saying he couldn't wait to meet me. Looking back, that should have been a red flag, but I was eager to get back into the dating scene after a long, dry spell. He suggested we go to this new Italian restaurant that had just opened up downtown. I checked it out online, and it looked cute and trendy, so I agreed. He offered to pick me up, but I politely declined, saying I preferred to meet him there. Another red flag he ignored, pressing the issue until I awkwardly agreed. I sent him my address, immediately regretting it. He showed up right on time, driving a sleek, black SUV. He hopped out to open the door for me, which I appreciated, but his smile seemed a little too wide, a little too eager. He was taller than I expected, maybe a bit too tall. And his eyes. They were this unsettling shade of gray, like storm clouds. The restaurant was nice, just like the pictures online. We were seated at a cozy table in the corner. Kyle was attentive, maybe overly so. He kept reaching across the table to touch my hand, which made me uncomfortable. He'd also kept staring at me like he was trying to see through me. I tried to make conversation, asking about his job and his hobbies. He gave vague answers, always turning the conversation back to me. He wanted to know everything about my life, my past relationships, my family. It felt like an interrogation, not a date. As the night progressed, Kyle's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started rambling about conspiracy theories and government surveillance. He claimed that they were always watching us, listening to our conversations. He kept glancing around the restaurant, his eyes darting nervously. I tried to laugh it off, but his intensity was starting to scare me. Then he leaned in close and whispered, "I know who you really are." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He just smiled. That same unsettling smile. "You can't hide from me," he said. "I see everything." I knew I had to get out of there. I made an excuse, saying I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. Kyle insisted on driving me, but I refused, saying I would call a ride. He didn't argue, but his eyes narrowed, and I could feel his gaze burning into me as I walked out of the restaurant. I called an Uber and waited outside, trying to calm my racing heart. When the car arrived, I practically jumped inside, slamming the door shut. I gave the driver my address and sat back, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As we drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, in the distance, I noticed a pair of headlights following us. They were getting closer and closer. I recognized the car. It was Kyle's black SUV. I panicked. "Driver, please go faster," I pleaded. "That car is following us." The driver, a young woman with bright pink hair, glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the SUV. She stepped on the gas, and we sped down the road, trying to outrun Kyle. The SUV stayed right behind us, its headlights blinding me. The chase went on for what felt like an eternity. We swerved through traffic, ran red lights, anything to get away. But Kyle was relentless, his SUV gaining on us with every turn. Finally, we reached my street. I told the driver to stop a few houses down from my place, hoping Kyle wouldn't see where I lived. I jumped out of the car and ran towards my house, fumbling with my keys. As I reached the front door, I heard the screech of tires behind me. I turned around and saw Kyle's SUV speeding towards me, its headlights aimed directly at me. I screamed and dove out of the way just as the SUV crashed into my front porch, sending debris flying everywhere. I scrambled to my feet and ran inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. I ran through the house, locking every door and window. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. I told the operator what had happened, begging them to send help. While I waited for the police to arrive, I heard Kyle banging on my front door, shouting my name. He sounded crazed, his voice filled with rage. I huddled in the corner of my living room, terrified for my life. The police finally arrived, sirens blaring. They surrounded the house and apprehended Kyle, who was still trying to break down the door. I watched as they dragged him away, his eyes fixed on me, filled with a chilling mixture of anger and obsession. Kyle was arrested and charged with several crimes, including stalking, reckless endangerment, and attempted assault. He's currently awaiting trial, but I still live in constant fear that he'll find a way to get out and come after me. I've changed my locks, installed a security system, and even started taking self-defense classes. But nothing can erase the memory of that night, the terror of being chased by a man who seemed determined to destroy my life. I keep replaying it in my head, wondering if I could have done something differently, if I could have seen the warning signs sooner. Now, I never plan a date at night. I don't want to see anyone. You won't believe what happened to me. Seriously, I still get chills thinking about it, and it's been almost a year. I was fresh out of a terrible breakup, feeling lonely and vulnerable, so against my better judgment, I decided to try online dating. I'd always been skeptical, but a friend of mine had met her husband on one of those apps, so I figured, why not? I made a profile, swiped through a bunch of faces, and eventually matched with a guy named Aaron. He was cute, had a good job, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We chatted for a couple of weeks, and he seemed totally normal, maybe even a little boring, which after my last relationship was exactly what I thought I wanted. So we made plans to go out. He suggested this new Italian place downtown, and I was actually looking forward to it. The night of the date, Aaron showed up right on time. He looked even better in person, and we had a really nice dinner. The conversation flowed easily, and we laughed a lot. He seemed attentive and kind, and by the end of the night, I was actually starting to feel optimistic about dating again. He walked me back to my apartment, and we shared a goodnight kiss. It wasn't fireworks or anything, but it was nice. He texted me later that night saying he had a great time and wanted to see me again. I agreed, and we made plans for the following weekend. That's when things started to get weird. Over the next few days, Aaron started texting me constantly, like nonstop. At first it was sweet, just checking in and saying he was thinking about me. But then it became more frequent and more intense. If I didn't respond within a few minutes, he'd send a follow-up text asking if I was okay. He started wanting to know every detail of my day, who I was with, what I was doing. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just really into me, but it started to feel suffocating. I told him I needed a little space, that I was busy with work and other things. He didn't take it well. He got passive-aggressive, accusing me of not being interested and saying he thought we had a connection. Despite my reservations, I still met with him again that weekend. I figured maybe I was overreacting, and I didn't want to judge him too harshly. The date started out okay, but it quickly went downhill. He kept bringing up the fact that I hadn't been as responsive to his texts, and he seemed jealous of anyone I mentioned, even my friends and family. He started asking me questions about my past relationships, digging for details and getting visibly upset when I didn't want to share everything. By the end of the night, I was completely turned off. I told him I didn't think we were a good match and that I didn't want to see him again. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me with this intense, unsettling look in his eyes. It made me incredibly uncomfortable. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. So wrong. The next day, I woke up to a barrage of texts and missed calls from Aaron. I ignored them, hoping he'd get the message, but he didn't. He started leaving voicemails begging me to talk to him, saying he was sorry and that he'd change. I blocked his number, but then he started emailing me. Pages and pages of rambling messages, filled with apologies, declarations of love, and subtle threats. I changed my email address, thinking that would stop him, but then he started showing up at my work. He'd stand across the street just watching me. One time, he even came inside and confronted me, demanding to know why I was ignoring him. I had to get security to escort him out. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I considered going to the police, but he hadn't technically done anything illegal yet. It was just harassment, but it was escalating quickly. Then one night, I came home to find my apartment had been broken into. Nothing was stolen, but things were moved around like someone had been searching for something. My heart sank. I knew it was him. I finally went to the police and filed a report. I showed them the texts, the emails, everything. They took it seriously and started investigating. They told me to get a restraining order, which I did immediately. For a few weeks, things were quiet. I thought maybe the restraining order had scared him off. But then one night, I was driving home from work, and I noticed a car following me. It was Aaron. He started tailgating me, flashing his headlights and honking his horn. I was so scared I could barely breathe. I sped up, trying to lose him, but he stayed right behind me. He was driving erratically, swerving in and out of lanes. I was terrified he was going to cause an accident. I called 911, and they told me to drive to the nearest police station. I finally made it to the station with Aaron still following close behind. As soon as I pulled into the parking lot, he screeched to a halt behind me and jumped out of his car. He started running towards me, screaming my name. The police officers tackled him to the ground and arrested him. It turned out he'd violated the restraining order and had a history of stalking and harassment. They found a stash of photos of me in his car, as well as a detailed log of my daily activities. He's in jail now awaiting trial. I'm still shaken up by the whole experience. I have a security system installed in my apartment, and I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe again. I learned a valuable lesson from all of this. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And don't be afraid to ask for help. I was so embarrassed and ashamed that I didn't reach out sooner if I should have. It could have saved me a lot of pain and suffering. I'm still not dating and not looking for a partner for a long time. Dating apps aren't as safe as you think they are, so be careful with who you give your information to. I still can't believe this actually happened. I mean, I've heard dating horror stories from friends. The guy who showed up 3 hours late, the woman who talked about her ex the entire night, the dude who tried to ghost after dessert. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for this. It started innocently enough. I had met Mark on a hiking group outing. He seemed nice, athletic, shared my love for the outdoors. We chatted easily, exchanged numbers, and made plans for a real date the following weekend. So far, so good, right? We decided on a casual dinner at a pizza place near my apartment. It was a place I'd been to a million times, familiar and comfortable. I even saw a couple of people I knew there. Mark showed up on time, dressed casually in jeans and a flannel. He looked genuinely excited to see me. The first hour was normal. We talked about our jobs, our families, our hobbies. He seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, asked thoughtful questions, and shared some funny anecdotes about his own life. I started to relax and think, okay, maybe this guy isn't so bad. Then around the time the pizza arrived, things started to shift. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible. He started asking me about my dreams. Not like, what are your career goals? More like, what do you dream about when you sleep? I told him I usually don't remember my dreams, which is true. But he pressed on, asking if I ever had nightmares or recurring dreams. I brushed it off, changed the subject, and focused on the pizza. But he wouldn't let go. He kept circling back to dreams, asking increasingly personal and strange questions. Had I ever dreamed about him? Did I believe dreams had hidden meanings? Did I ever feel like my dreams were trying to tell me something? I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable, but I chalked it up to him being a bit eccentric. I mean, everyone has their quirks, right? I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, but he seemed fixated on the dream thing. That's when he told me he was a lucid dreamer. He claimed he could control his dreams, visit different worlds, and even influence the dreams of others. He said he had been practicing for years and was getting really good at it. I laughed nervously and said, "That's interesting." I honestly didn't know what to say. Part of me thought he was joking, but he seemed so serious, so intense. He leaned closer, his eyes sparkling in the dim light of the restaurant. "I've been watching you, my name. In my dreams. I know things about you that you haven't told anyone." My heart started pounding. This was no longer just a bit eccentric. This was full-blown creepy. I forced a smile and said, "Okay, Mark, I think I'm going to head home. I'm not feeling so great." I started to gather my things, but he reached across the table and grabbed my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to stop me. "Don't go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need to show you something." I tried to pull away, but he held on tighter. "Mark, you're hurting me," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't let go. Instead, he started whispering something under his breath. It sounded like gibberish, some kind of strange incantation. People around us started to stare. I was terrified. Suddenly, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, I was lying on the floor. Mark was kneeling beside me, shaking me gently. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice sounding genuinely concerned. I sat up, my head throbbing. "What happened?" I asked, my voice still shaky. "You fainted," he said. "I think you were just stressed. I called you an Uber." I looked around. The restaurant was almost empty. The table was cleared, and my purse was on the chair next to me. I felt disoriented, confused. Had I really just fainted, or had something else happened? The Uber arrived a few minutes later, and I practically ran out of the restaurant. I didn't say goodbye to Mark. I just wanted to get away from him as quickly as possible. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept having vivid, disturbing dreams. Dreams where I was trapped in a dark, endless maze, being chased by a shadowy figure. Dreams where Mark was standing in front of me, his eyes glowing red and whispering those strange words again. I started avoiding sleep altogether, staying up late watching TV or reading, anything to keep the nightmares at bay. I told a couple of friends about what happened, but they just dismissed it as a weird first date gone wrong. They told me I was overreacting. But I knew something was different. Something had changed. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night, gasping for air. I was covered in sweat, and my heart was racing. I looked around my room, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the corner, shrouded in shadow, was Mark. I screamed. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at me with those intense, unsettling eyes. I lunged for my phone and dialed 911, but before I could say anything, the line went dead. The power in my apartment went out. I was plunged into complete darkness. I could hear Mark moving closer, his footsteps soft and deliberate. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the door, but it was locked. I couldn't get it open. I was trapped. I spent the rest of the night hiding in my closet, listening to Mark's footsteps as he roamed through my apartment. He never spoke, never made any aggressive moves. He just seemed to be waiting. When the sun finally came up, the power came back on. I cautiously opened the closet door and peered out. Mark was gone. I immediately called the police, told them everything that had happened. They took a report, but they didn't seem to take me seriously. They said there was no evidence of a break-in, no sign of Mark ever being there. I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew what I had seen. I moved out of my apartment the next day. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media accounts, and tried to disappear. I haven't seen Mark since that night, but I still have nightmares. I still feel like he's watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep so he can invade my dreams again. I don't sleep well. I keep a baseball bat next to my bed. I'm still scared, and I always will be. I still can't believe this actually happened. It was a date. It was supposed to be fun. You won't believe what happened to me last summer. Seriously, I still get chills thinking about it. I was working as a camp counselor at this sleepaway camp in the Poconos. Classic summer job, right? Long days, screaming kids, questionable food, and maybe, just maybe, a little camp romance. I wasn't actively looking, but hey, a girl can dream. There were a few cute guys on staff, but nobody really caught my eye until Greg showed up. He was a new counselor, transferred from another camp halfway through the summer. Tall, dark hair, kind eyes, a ridiculously charming British accent. the whole package. He was also super into outdoor stuff, which was a huge plus at a camp. We bonded over shared duties like leading hikes and teaching kids how to build campfires. He was funny, genuine, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We started spending more and more time together outside of work hours. Late night talks by the lake, sneaking off for ice cream in town, all the usual summer romance stuff. I was completely smitten. He was so different from the guys I usually dated, more mature, more adventurous, and way more mysterious. That's where the first red flag should have gone up, but I was too caught up in the moment to notice. Greg didn't talk much about his past, his family, or his life back in England. He'd brush it off with a vague "it's boring" or "nothing special." I figured he was just private, and I didn't want to push him. Things started getting weird a few weeks into our relationship. Greg became possessive. He didn't like me talking to other guys, even the campers. He'd get this strange look in his eyes whenever I'd laugh at someone else's joke. He'd also start showing up unexpectedly wherever I was, like he was keeping tabs on me. One night, after campfire, I was walking back to my cabin with a group of other counselors. Greg was supposed to be on duty, checking the campers' cabins, but he suddenly appeared out of the woods. He grabbed my arm, pulled me away from the group, and started yelling at me for flirting with one of the other counselors. I was shocked and embarrassed. I tried to explain that we were just talking, but he wouldn't listen. His grip on my arm tightened, and his eyes were wild. I started to get scared. That night, I couldn't sleep. Greg's behavior was really starting to freak me out. I decided I needed to talk to him about it, set some boundaries, or maybe even end things altogether. But the next morning, he was gone. I mean, completely gone. His cabin was empty, his belongings were missing, and nobody had seen him since the night before. I asked the camp director what happened, and he said Greg had requested an emergency leave of absence due to a family matter back in England. He said he'd gotten a call early that morning and had to leave immediately. I was relieved he was gone, but also confused and hurt. He hadn't even said goodbye. Over the next few days, I tried to push it out of my mind, focus on the campers, and pretend like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then one of the other counselors, Sarah, came to me with something disturbing. She had been looking through old camp records for a project, and she stumbled across Greg's application. The application was a mess, incomplete, inconsistent information, and no verifiable references. But the most disturbing thing was the photo. It wasn't a photo of Greg. It was a photo of someone else entirely. We showed the photo to the camp director, and he was just as shocked as we were. He said he had never seen that picture before and didn't know how Greg got hired. He called the police and they started an investigation. That's when things got really creepy. The police discovered that Greg had been using a fake name and a stolen identity. He had no connection to the camp, no history of working with children, and no known address. They couldn't find any trace of him, like he had vanished into thin air. The police asked me a lot of questions about my relationship with Greg. I told them everything I knew, even the weird and possessive stuff. They seemed particularly interested in the fact that he had shown up unexpectedly in the woods the night he disappeared. A few days later, the police called me back to the station. They had found something in the woods near where Greg had been last seen. It was a small hidden campsite, complete with a tent, sleeping bag, and a few personal belongings. Among the belongings was a notebook. The notebook was filled with disturbing writings, ramblings about obsession, control, and the need to possess someone completely. There were also detailed descriptions of me, my movements, my habits, and my daily routine. It was like Greg had been stalking me, documenting my every move. But the most chilling thing was the last entry in the notebook. It was dated the night he disappeared. It read, "She's starting to suspect. I have to disappear before she figures out the truth." The police never found Greg. The case went cold. I left the camp at the end of the summer, shaken and traumatized. I spent months looking over my shoulder, wondering if he was still out there watching me. To this day, I have no idea who Greg really was or what he wanted. I don't know if he was dangerous or just incredibly disturbed. But I know that he completely shattered my trust in people and taught me a hard lesson about being careful who I let into my life. You never really know who someone is, no matter how charming or perfect they seem. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who wear a human face. I still can't believe this actually happened, even though it's been a few years. I mean, you read about stuff like this online or see it in movies, but you never think it could happen to you. Looking back, there were so many red flags I ignored, but at the time I was just lonely, I guess, and maybe a little naive. It started with a seemingly innocent message on a local online forum. I was part of a group for hiking enthusiasts in my area, and someone posted looking for a hiking buddy for a weekend trip up to the Cascade Mountains. The poster's name was Forest Friend, and his profile had a picture of a blurry mountain range. His message was pretty straightforward, saying he enjoyed long hikes and was looking for someone with experience who could handle a challenging trek. I've been hiking in the Cascades my whole life and considered myself pretty experienced, so I responded. We exchanged a few messages back and forth, discussing our favorite trails and our skill levels. He seemed nice enough, a little reserved, but nothing that immediately set off alarm bells. He said his real name was Harrison, and he was in his late 30s like me. After a week or so of messaging, we decided to meet for coffee to discuss the trip in more detail. He took a small, out-of-the-way cafe I'd never been to before. That should have been the first red flag, honestly. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table in the back corner. He was tall and lanky, with long, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. He was wearing hiking boots and a worn-out flannel shirt, which I guess fit the forest friend persona. The coffee date was okay. He was quiet, but he seemed knowledgeable about hiking. He talked about the specific trail he wanted to do, a remote one that was known for its challenging terrain and stunning views. He mentioned that it was important to be prepared and self-sufficient, since there wouldn't be any cell service or other hikers around. I brushed it off as him being cautious. We spent the next few weeks planning the trip. He was very meticulous, almost obsessively so. He made detailed lists of supplies, mapped out our route with precise timings, and insisted on checking my gear to make sure it was up to par. He kept emphasizing the importance of being prepared for anything, which, in hindsight, was more ominous than helpful. The morning of the hike arrived, and I met Harrison at the trailhead. It was a beautiful day, sunny and crisp. We set off, and the first few hours were uneventful. The trail was challenging, but the scenery was breathtaking. We talked a bit, but Harrison mostly kept to himself. He seemed more focused on the trail than on conversation. As we climbed higher, the trail became steeper and more rugged. We passed a few other hikers on their way down, but after a certain point, we were completely alone. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of our boots on the rocks and the wind whistling through the trees. That's when Harrison started to change. He became more agitated, constantly looking around like he was expecting someone to jump out of the woods. He started muttering to himself, and his pace quickened, leaving me struggling to keep up. When I asked him if he was okay, he just glared at me and said, "We need to keep moving." As the sun began to set, we reached a small clearing. Harrison announced that this was where we would set up camp for the night. I was exhausted and relieved to stop, but as I started unpacking my gear, I noticed something strange. Harrison hadn't brought a tent. "Where's your tent?" I asked. He just shrugged and said, "We don't need one. We'll sleep under the stars." I was uneasy about it. I'm not a huge fan of sleeping without a tent, especially in the mountains. But I figured it was just for one night, and I didn't want to make a fuss. We built a small fire and cooked some dinner. Harrison was still acting strangely, his eyes darting around, his hands fidgeting. After dinner, as the fire died down, he started telling me about himself. He said he'd always felt like an outsider, like he didn't belong in the world. He talked about how he hated people and how he preferred the solitude of the forest. His voice was low and intense, and it made my skin crawl. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said, I've been watching you for a while. I know everything about you." I tried to laugh it off, but my voice was shaking. "What are you talking about?" He just smiled, a chilling, unsettling smile. "I know where you live. I know your friends. I know your family. I know everything." I realized then that I was in serious danger. This wasn't just a weird hiking trip. This was something much worse. I knew I had to get away from him. I stood up, trying to appear calm. "I'm going to go get some water from the stream," I said. He didn't try to stop me. He just sat there by the fire, watching me with that same unsettling smile. I walked as casually as I could towards the stream, but as soon as I was out of his sight, I started running. I ran as fast as I could, stumbling over rocks and roots, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get as far away from him as possible. I ran for what felt like hours until I was completely exhausted. I found a small cave and huddled inside, shivering with cold and fear. I didn't sleep that night. Every rustle of leaves, Every snap of a twig sent a jolt of terror through me. When the sun finally rose, I started hiking again, following the stream downhill. I eventually stumbled upon a logging road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver was kind enough to take me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They launched a search for Harrison, but they never found him. They found our campsite, but he was long gone. They questioned me extensively, but I couldn't tell them much more than what I'd already told you. I still hike, but I never hike alone. I always tell someone where I'm going, and I carry a satellite phone in case of emergencies. I try not to let what happened ruin my love for the outdoors, but it's hard. I still think about Harrison sometimes, about that unsettling smile and the way he said he knew everything about me. I wonder where he is now and if he's still out there, preying on unsuspecting hikers. And I still can't believe it actually happened to me. I still get chills thinking about what happened during what was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway I planned with someone I barely knew. I'd met him online on a forum dedicated to obscure historical documentaries. He seemed intelligent, well-read, and shared my fascination with forgotten corners of history. His name was Arthur, and after a couple of weeks of messaging, we decided to meet up for a drink. He wasn't exactly what I expected. He was older than his profile picture suggested, maybe late 40s with a receding hairline and nervous energy that radiated off him in waves. But he was polite, and the conversation flowed easily. We talked about everything from medieval folklore to forgotten languages, and I found myself genuinely enjoying his company. We went on a few more dates, and soon Arthur suggested a weekend trip to a remote cabin he owned in the mountains. I hesitated. It felt too soon, too intense. But Arthur was insistent, promising breathtaking scenery, peaceful solitude, and a chance to really connect. I'd been feeling stressed and overwhelmed with work, and the idea of escaping to the mountains was incredibly appealing. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told a friend where I was going, sent her Arthur's photo and license plate number, and promised to check in regularly. I packed a bag, tried to ignore the knot of unease in my stomach, and met Arthur early on Friday morning. The drive was long and winding, taking us deeper and deeper into the dense, wooded mountains. The roads became narrow and unpaved, and the cell service disappeared. The landscape was beautiful, but the isolation was unsettling. Arthur, however, seemed completely at ease, chatting animatedly about the local flora and fauna, pointing out historical landmarks along the way. We finally arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. It was even more isolated than I had imagined, a small rustic structure nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. There was no other sign of civilization for miles. The cabin itself was old and slightly dilapidated, with peeling paint and a musty smell. It had electricity, but no running water. Arthur apologized for the lack of amenities, but assured me the beauty of the location made up for it. That first evening was uneventful. Arthur cooked a simple meal, we drank some wine, and talked. I tried to relax and enjoy the scenery, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Arthur's behavior seemed to have shifted since we left the city. He was more intense, more possessive, constantly touching my arm or shoulder, making me feel claustrophobic. As the night wore on, he began to tell me stories about the history of the area, tales of early settlers, Native American legends, and strange occurrences in the woods. He spoke of ancient rituals, unexplained disappearances, and a dark energy that permeated the mountains. The stories were fascinating, but they also made me increasingly uneasy. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, Arthur pulled out an old, leather-bound book. He said it was a collection of local folklore, passed down through generations. He began to read aloud, his voice low and hypnotic, reciting tales of creatures that roamed the woods at night, spirits that haunted the mountains, and a malevolent force that preyed on unsuspecting travelers. The stories were gruesome and disturbing, filled with graphic descriptions of violence and death. I told him I wasn't really in the mood for scary stories, but he seemed not to hear me, continuing to read in his monotone voice. Eventually, I managed to convince him to stop, but the damage was done. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the sounds of the forest, my imagination running wild. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves, sounded like a monster lurking outside. Sleep didn't come easy. I had a disturbing dream. I was in the dark forest with Arthur, who was smiling. It was a smile I'd never seen before, a smile that felt evil. He was reaching out, motioning for me to come closer. When I woke up, I was sweating and I felt a feeling of dreadful anxiety. I tried going back to sleep, but I couldn't. I was scared to fall back to sleep. I didn't want to have the same dream. The next day, things went from bad to worse. Arthur insisted on taking me on a hike deep into the woods, claiming he wanted to show me a hidden waterfall. I reluctantly agreed, but as we walked, I became increasingly aware of how isolated we were. There were no trails, no signs of other people, just dense forest stretching in every direction. Arthur seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading me through thick underbrush and over fallen logs. He was strangely silent, his eyes fixed on some distant point. I tried to make conversation, but he barely responded. The feeling of unease I had since arriving at the cabin intensified into a full-blown panic. As we walked further and further into the woods, the atmosphere became oppressive. The air grew heavy and still, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of trees. The forest seemed to close in around us, and I felt like we were being watched. I was really anxious, and I just wanted to go back, but Arthur wouldn't have it. Suddenly, Arthur stopped. He pointed to a small clearing ahead, where a crumbling stone structure stood amidst the trees. "This is it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The waterfall." But it wasn't a waterfall. It was an old, abandoned cemetery. The tombstones were cracked and weathered, covered in moss and lichen. Many of the graves were unmarked, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. I was horrified. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. Arthur smiled, that same unsettling smile I'd seen in my dream. "A place of rest," he said, "and a place of power." He began to walk among the graves, touching the tombstones, whispering to himself. I stood frozen, too scared to move. The feeling of dread was overwhelming. I knew with chilling certainty that something terrible was about to happen. That's when he turned to me, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light. "I brought you here for a reason," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I need your help." I didn't wait to find out what kind of help he needed. I turned and ran as fast as I could, back the way we had come. I could hear Arthur behind me calling my name, his footsteps pounding on the forest floor. I ran blindly, stumbling through the woods, desperate to escape. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from him. I ran for what felt like hours until I collapsed, exhausted and terrified, at the edge of the forest. I eventually found my way back to the cabin, but Arthur was gone. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my bag, jumped in my car, and drove away, never looking back. I reported the incident to the police, but they couldn't do much without any evidence. Arthur disappeared, and I never heard from him again. But I'll never forget that weekend, the isolation, the cemetery, and the look in Arthur's eyes. I still get chills thinking about how close I came to becoming another forgotten victim in those dark, lonely mountains. I still have the nightmares, and I don't think it will ever be the same. You won't believe what happened to me. Seriously, I still have trouble wrapping my head around it, and it's been almost a year. I've told bits and pieces to a few close friends, but I always leave out the really messed up parts. Partly because I don't want to relive it, partly because I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy. But I need to get it off my chest, so here goes. It all started with a seemingly innocent dating app. I was newly single, a little lonely, and figured, why not? I swiped through a bunch of faces, had a few boring conversations, and then I matched with him. Paul. He was different. Not in a bad way initially. He was handsome, sure, but it was more than that. He was intense, passionate, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, the real me, not just the surface level stuff. We talked for hours every night, about everything from our childhoods to our hopes and dreams. It felt like we had an instant connection, like we had known each other forever. After a week of nonstop texting and phone calls, we decided to meet in person. He suggested a small, out-of-the-way restaurant that I had never heard of before. I looked it up online, and it seemed legit, just a cozy little Italian place. I was a little nervous, but mostly excited. When I arrived, Paul was already there, waiting for me at a table in the back. He looked even better in person than he did in his pictures. He had this magnetic energy about him that drew me in. The dinner went great. We laughed, we shared stories, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. He was charming, witty, and attentive. I was completely smitten. We started seeing each other regularly after that. He would take me on these elaborate, romantic dates. Picnics in the park, sunset walks on the beach, even a surprise weekend getaway to a secluded cabin in the woods. He was incredibly generous, showering me with gifts and affection. It felt like a fairy tale. But then things started to get weird. It started small, subtle things that I initially dismissed as quirks. He was incredibly possessive of my time, getting upset if I made plans with friends or family without consulting him first. He would constantly text me throughout the day, wanting to know where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing. He also had this strange fascination with my past, constantly grilling me about my previous relationships. He would get jealous and angry, even if I just mentioned an ex-boyfriend in passing. It felt like he was trying to erase my past, to rewrite my history. Then there were the dreams. I started having these incredibly vivid, disturbing dreams, always featuring Paul in some kind of violent or threatening situation. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, feeling like something terrible was about to happen. I tried to talk to Paul about it, but he would just dismiss my concerns, telling me that I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination run wild. He would reassure me that he loved me, that he would never do anything to hurt me. I wanted to believe him, but something just didn't feel right. One night, I was at his apartment, and he asked me to stay over. I hesitated. I wasn't ready to take that step yet. He could tell I was uncomfortable, and he started pressuring me, telling me that if I really loved him, I would trust him, that I would do anything for him. I finally relented, feeling guilty and ashamed. We went to bed, and I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake this feeling of unease. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to fall asleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to Paul standing over me, staring down at me with a strange, vacant expression on his face. He was holding something in his hand, something shiny and metallic. "Paul?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me, his eyes blank and unseeing. I tried to sit up, but he pushed me back down, holding me firmly in place. He raised his hand, and I saw that he was holding a knife. I screamed. He didn't say a word. He just brought the knife down, aiming for my chest. I managed to roll out of the way just in time, and the knife grazed my arm. I scrambled out of bed and ran towards the door, but he grabbed me, tackling me to the ground. We struggled for what felt like an eternity. I was screaming and crying, fighting for my life. I managed to kick him in the groin, and he stumbled back, giving me a chance to escape. I ran out of the apartment and into the street, screaming for help. A neighbor heard me and called the police. When the police arrived, they found Paul inside the apartment covered in blood. He had apparently tried to end himself after I escaped. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder. I later found out that he had a long history of mental illness and had been stalking me for weeks before we even met. He had created fake profiles on the dating app, specifically targeting me, learning everything he could about me before making contact. I testified against him in court, and he was found guilty and sentenced to a long prison term. I'm still dealing with the trauma of what happened. I have nightmares, flashbacks, and I'm terrified of dating. But I'm also grateful to be alive. I learned a valuable lesson about trusting my instincts and being careful about who I let into my life. You really never know what someone is capable of. To this day, I am still fearful of meeting someone new, and the thought of finding someone makes me scared. Be careful out there. You never know who is sitting on the other side of the screen. I still can't believe this actually happened. Like I replay it in my head sometimes, and it feels like some messed up movie scene, not something that actually happened to me. It all started with this app called Soulmate Finder, which in hindsight should have been my first clue that things were going to go sideways. I mean, come on, Soulmate Finder. It's practically baiting for trouble. Anyway, I had been single for a while and honestly just wanted someone to watch Netflix with. I wasn't looking for the love of my life, just someone to share a pizza and a bad rom-com with on a Friday night. So I created a profile, answered all the ridiculously detailed questions about my personality and preferences, and started swiping. That's when I matched with Alan. His profile was different. He didn't have any of those posed, filtered pictures that everyone else had. Instead, it was just a few candid shots of him doing everyday things, reading at a coffee shop, walking his dog in the park, laughing with friends. He seemed genuine, down to earth, and yeah, I'll admit it, pretty cute. We started chatting, and he was surprisingly witty and intelligent. He wasn't trying too hard, just being himself. We talked about books, movies, music, all the usual stuff. But he also asked deeper questions, things that actually made me think. It was refreshing. After a week of chatting, he suggested we meet up for dinner. I was hesitant at first. I'm always a little nervous meeting people from the internet, but he seemed so nice, so normal, that I decided to take a chance. We met at this small Italian restaurant downtown. Alan was even more attractive in person. He was tall, with kind eyes and a disarming smile. We talked for hours, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. It felt like I'd known him forever. He was funny, intelligent, and genuinely interested in what I had to say. It was honestly the best first date I'd ever been on. After dinner, he walked me back to my apartment. We stood outside my door for a few minutes, just talking, and then he leaned in and kissed me. It was perfect. I invited him up, and we spent the rest of the night cuddling on the couch, watching movies, and just enjoying each other's company. It felt like I'd finally found someone special. The next few weeks were amazing. We went on dates, explored the city, and spent countless nights talking and laughing. I was completely smitten. He was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Then things started to get weird. It started subtly. He began asking about my friends, my family, my routine. Harmless questions at first, but they became more frequent, more detailed. He wanted to know where I worked, who I talked to, what I did on my days off. Then came the gifts. At first, it was just small things. A book I'd mentioned wanting to read, a coffee from my favorite cafe. But then they started getting more extravagant, expensive jewelry, designer clothes. I told him he didn't have to do that I appreciated the thought, but that it was too much. He just smiled and said he wanted to spoil me. Then came the possessiveness. He didn't like it when I spent time with my friends. He wanted me all to himself. He started showing up unannounced at my work just to say hi. He'd call and text me constantly when I wasn't with him, demanding to know where I was and what I was doing. I tried to talk to him about it, to explain that I needed space, that his behavior was making me uncomfortable. He'd always apologize, promise to change, but then the behavior would just start up again. One night, I was at a friend's birthday party. I hadn't seen my friends in weeks, and was really looking forward to it. Alan knew about the party, and I told him I'd be home late. He seemed okay with it. But then, around midnight, he showed up at the party. He didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway staring at me. I felt the chill run down my spine. I excused myself and went outside to talk to him. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer, just grabbed my arm and started pulling me towards his car. "Let's go home," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. I resisted, pulling my arm away. "No, I'm not ready to go home yet. I'm having fun with my friends." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and something else, something unsettling. Then he smiled. A slow, creepy smile that sent shivers down my spine. "You're mine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You belong to me." That's when I knew I had to get away from him. I turned and ran back inside the party, grabbing my purse and keys. I told my friends I had to leave, that something was wrong. They could see the fear in my eyes and didn't ask any questions. I ran to my car and drove home as fast as I could, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds to make sure he wasn't following me. I got to my apartment and locked the door behind me, barricading it with furniture. I called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do unless he actually threatened me. I spent the rest of the night puddled in my apartment, terrified, waiting for him to show up. He didn't. But the next morning, I found a note on my doorstep. It was written in Alan's handwriting, and it said just one thing: "You can't hide from me." I moved a week later, changed my number, deleted my social media, and cut off contact with everyone who knew Alan. I'm still terrified of him, still looking over my shoulder, wondering if he's out there watching me. I still can't believe this actually happened. That someone I thought I knew, someone I trusted, could turn out to be so dangerous. I'll never use a dating app again, and I'll never trust anyone as easily as I trusted Alan. It was a terrible experience. What I'm about to tell you is completely true. I know it sounds crazy, and if someone else told me this story, I probably wouldn't believe them. But it happened, and it changed my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. It started, innocently enough, with a dating app. I was in my late 20s, recently divorced, and trying to navigate the bewildering world of online dating. After a few disastrous dates, I almost gave up entirely. Then I matched with someone named Adrian. His profile was intriguing. He was handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a captivating smile. He listed his interests as hiking, photography, and philosophy. He seemed intelligent, artistic, and genuinely kind. Our initial conversations were stimulating and engaging. We talked about everything from our favorite books to our deepest fears. He seemed to understand me in a way that no one else ever had. After a week of chatting online, we decided to meet in person. He suggested a secluded hiking trail just outside the city. I hesitated. Meeting a stranger in a remote location felt risky. But he was so persuasive, so charming, and I genuinely felt a connection with him. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The day of the hike was beautiful. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the air was crisp and clean. Adrian was waiting for me at the trailhead, smiling warmly. He was even more handsome in person, with a disarming charisma that immediately put me at ease. We started hiking, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. He was attentive, listening intently to everything I said and responding with thoughtful insights. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. We hiked for hours, exploring the winding trails and admiring the breathtaking scenery. As the sun began to set, we reached a secluded clearing overlooking the valley. The view was spectacular. Adrian pulled out a blanket, and we sat down to watch the sunset. He put his arm around me, and I leaned into him, feeling a sense of comfort and security I hadn't felt in a long time. Then everything changed. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, Adrian's demeanor shifted. His smile faded, his eyes grew cold, and his grip tightened around my arm. He turned to me, his face contorted into a grotesque expression I didn't recognize. "You're not who I thought you were," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're not worthy." I didn't know what he was talking about. I tried to pull away, but his grip was too strong. He held me captive, his eyes burning into mine. "I've been watching you," he said. "I know your secrets. I know your flaws. You're just a disappointment." I was terrified. Who was this man? What did he want from me? I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear. "You're going to pay for your sins," he whispered. Suddenly, he produced a small, ornate knife from his pocket. The blade glinted in the fading light. I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I was in grave danger. He raised the knife, his eyes filled with a chilling intensity. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the worst. But then something extraordinary happened. A blinding light erupted from the sky, illuminating the clearing. A figure descended from the heavens, radiating an otherworldly glow. It was an angel, or at least, that's the only way I can describe it. The angel raised its hand, and a wave of energy surged through the air, knocking Adrian to the ground. The knife clattered to the ground, and he writhed in pain, screaming in agony. The angel turned to me, its eyes filled with compassion. "You are safe now," it said, its voice resonating with divine power. "He cannot harm you." Then, as quickly as it appeared, the angel vanished, ascending back into the heavens. I stared in disbelief, my mind reeling. Had I just witnessed a miracle? Was I hallucinating? I didn't know what to think. I looked at Adrian. He was still lying on the ground, moaning in pain. I could have left him there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Despite everything, I couldn't abandon him to die. I helped him to his feet, and we stumbled back to the trailhead in silence. When we reached my car, I drove him to the nearest hospital. He was treated for his injuries and then taken into police custody. I later learned that Adrian had a long history of mental illness and violent behavior. He had been stalking me for weeks, meticulously planning our encounter. He believed that I was a manifestation of evil and that he had to end me to save the world. The police investigation revealed that Adrian had been involved in a cult that worshipped ancient deities and practiced ritualistic sacrifice. He had been searching for a suitable victim for months, and I was his chosen target. To this day, I don't know if what I saw that night was real or a figment of my imagination. I don't know if it was an angel or some sort of hallucination brought on by extreme fear. But I know that something extraordinary happened, something that saved my life. The experience changed me profoundly. I realized how fragile life is and how easily it can be taken away. I learned to trust my instincts and to be cautious in all the people I let into my life. and I discovered that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. I still struggle to make sense of what happened that night, but I know that I am grateful to be alive, and I will never forget the angel who saved me. This is my story, and it is completely true, as unbelievable as it may seem. I thought I was being paranoid until the messages started appearing on the steamed up mirror in my bathroom. That's when the chill really set in, the kind that burrows deep under your skin and refuses to leave. It started like any other online dating experience. I had been single for a couple of years, working too much and not really making an effort to meet anyone. My friend convinced me to try out one of those dating apps, promising it wasn't as soul-crushing as I thought. I swiped through a few profiles, cringing at the predictable gym selfies and cliche travel photos until I came across Liam. He seemed normal. His profile was simple, a few photos of him hiking, one of him with a dog, and a bio that said he enjoyed reading and exploring new places. We matched, and our conversations were easy, flowing naturally. He was funny, intelligent, and genuinely seemed interested in getting to know me. After a week of chatting, we decided to meet for coffee. The date went well. Liam was even better in person. He was attentive, made me laugh, and we had a lot in common. We talked for hours, losing track of time until the coffee shop started closing up. We made plans to see each other again, and I left feeling optimistic, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next few weeks, Liam and I became inseparable. We went on hikes, saw movies, cooked dinner at each other's apartments. He was charming and affectionate, and I found myself falling for him hard. Everything felt so right, so easy. Maybe too easy. That's when the little things started happening. Things that on their own seemed insignificant, but together created a nagging feeling of unease. He always seemed to know things he shouldn't, like what I had for lunch or a conversation I had with a coworker. I chalked it up to him being a good listener and me maybe oversharing. Then there was a time I caught him staring at me, not in a loving way, but with this intense, almost unnerving gaze. When I asked him what he was looking at, he'd just smile and say, "Just admiring you." It felt off. He also started mirroring my behavior, picking up my phrases, adopting my mannerisms. It was subtle, but noticeable. It was like he was trying to become me, or at least an idealized version of me. I tried to brush these things off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just insecure, projecting my past relationship baggage onto him. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, I came home from work to find Liam waiting for me in my apartment. He had a key, which he had never asked for. When I questioned him, he said he found it under the flower pile outside my door and thought he'd surprise me. I was annoyed, but I let it go. That night, I took a shower, and when I stepped out, the bathroom mirror was fogged up. As I wiped it clean, I saw something scrawled in the condensation. "I'm watching you." My blood ran cold. I ran out of the bathroom and confronted Liam, who was sitting on the couch, innocently reading a book. He denied writing the message, saying I must be imagining things. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. Over the next few days, the messages continued to appear, always on the bathroom mirror after I showered. There were always variations of the same theme. "I'm watching you. You can't hide. I know everything." My paranoia reached fever pitch. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow, checking every room in my apartment before I went to bed. I changed my locks, installed security cameras, and even considered moving. But I was too scared to leave, afraid of what Liam might do if he knew I was onto him. I finally decided to confide in my good friend. She listened patiently as I recounted everything that had been happening, her expression growing increasingly concerned. She agreed that something was definitely wrong and urged me to go to the police. The police took my concerns seriously, but they said they couldn't do anything without concrete evidence. They suggested I try to catch Liam in the act, which terrified me, but I knew I had to do something. I decided to set a trap. I told Liam I had to work late one night and wouldn't be home until after midnight. In reality, I was hiding at Sarah's apartment watching the live feed from my security cameras. Around 10 p.m., I saw Lan enter my apartment. He moved through the rooms, his movements slow and deliberate. He went into the bathroom, and I watched in horror as he turned on the shower. waited for the mirror to fog up, and then wrote another message, "You're mine forever." I called the police and they arrived within minutes. They arrested Liam, who didn't resist. As they led him away, he turned to the camera and smiled, a chilling, vacant smile that will haunt me forever. After Liam's arrest, I learned the truth about him. He had been stalking me for months, even before we matched on the dating app. He had hacked my social media accounts, installed spyware on my phone, and was secretly watching my every move. He had created this elaborate fantasy in his head, convinced that we were meant to be together, and he wouldn't let anything or anyone stand in his way. He was eventually charged with stalking, harassment, and unlawful entry. He's in prison now, but I still live in fear, wondering if he'll ever get out, wondering if he's still watching me. I thought I was being paranoid, but it turns out my instincts were right. And sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who look the most normal. I never used dating apps again, and if someone shows even the smallest sign of what Liam showed, I would run as fast as I could. I'm still shaken up from this experience, even months later. I replay it in my head constantly, wondering if I could have seen the signs, if I could have done anything differently. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about people. It started pretty normally. I was working late one night and decided to hop on a dating app just to kill some time. I wasn't really expecting to find anything, but I ended up matching with a guy named Ads. He seemed like your average, slightly nerdy guy, glasses a bit shy in his photos, but with a kind smile. His profile said he was a software engineer, liked hiking, and was looking for someone to share his love of board games with. Sounded harmless enough. We chatted for a few days, and he seemed genuinely nice and funny. He wasn't pushy or overly flirty, just normal. We decided to meet for coffee the following weekend. I met him, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The coffee date went well. It was a little awkward, but endearingly so. He told me about his job, his hobbies, and his family. He seemed like a good guy, maybe a little lonely, but definitely not someone who would hurt a fly. We ended up talking for hours, and I actually found myself enjoying his company. We made plans to go hiking the following weekend. I was excited to see if the personality was as enjoyable as the coffee date. The hike was fun. It was a beautiful day, and we had a great time exploring the trails and talking about everything and nothing. He even packed a picnic lunch, which was a sweet gesture. By the end of the day, I was starting to feel like I might actually have met someone special. We started seeing each other more regularly after that. We went to movies, tried new restaurants, and even spent a few nights just cuddling on the couch and watching Netflix. He was always respectful and considerate, and I felt comfortable and safe around him. He slowly took off the glasses and started to dress more nicely. Then, about a month into dating, things started to change. The first red flag was his increasing need for control. He started wanting to know exactly where I was at all times, who I was with, and what I was doing. He would get subtly jealous if I spent time with my friends, making comments about how I was neglecting him. I had mentioned before that I used to be in a relationship that was abusive, and he said he would never treat me like that. At first, I brushed it off as him just being insecure, but it started to feel suffocating. I tried to talk to him about it, but he would just get defensive, accusing me of not trusting him. He would say that he just wanted to protect me, that he was worried about me getting hurt. Then he started becoming obsessed with my appearance. He would make comments about my weight, my clothes, and my makeup. He would tell me that I looked prettier with my hair a certain way or that I should wear more revealing clothes. I started to feel like I was constantly being judged, like I wasn't good enough for him. One night, we were getting ready to go out, and I was wearing a dress that I really liked. He looked me up and down and said, "Are you sure you want to wear that? It's a little revealing, don't you think?" I was taken aback. "What's wrong with it?" I asked. He shrugged. "It just seems like you're trying to get attention from other guys," he said. I felt my blood boil. "I'm wearing this dress because I like it," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm not trying to get attention from anyone." He rolled his eyes. "Whatever," he said. "Just don't complain when guys start hitting on you." I couldn't take it anymore. "You know what?" I said. "I'm not going anywhere with you tonight." He looked surprised. "What? Why not?" he asked. "Because I'm tired of you trying to control me and tell me what to do," I said. "I'm done." He started to plead with me, telling me that he was sorry, that he didn't mean to hurt me, that he would change. But I didn't believe him. I knew that this was just the beginning, that if I stayed with him, things would only get worse. I broke up with him that night. He didn't take it well. He started calling and texting me incessantly, begging me to give him another chance. When I didn't respond, he started showing up at my apartment, my work, and even my gym. I felt I was being stalked. I eventually had to get a restraining order against him. He was furious. He started sending me threatening messages, telling me that I would regret what I had done, that he would make my life a living hell. I was terrified. I knew that he was capable of anything. I started sleeping with a knife under my pillow and checking my locks multiple times before bed. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid that he was watching me. One night, I was walking home from work when I noticed someone following me. I quickened my pace, but they kept getting closer. I started to run, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back, and it was him. He was running after me, his face contorted with rage. I screamed and ran faster, desperately trying to get away. I got to my apartment building. I realized he had caught up to me. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "I told you that you would regret this," he said, his voice shaking with anger. I screamed again, and a neighbor heard me and came running to help. He saw what was happening and called the police. Ads was arrested and charged with violating the restraining order and stalking. He's currently awaiting trial. I'm still shaken up from this experience. I'm still afraid of him, afraid of what he might do. I'm also afraid of dating again, afraid of meeting someone who will try to control me and hurt me. It's been very difficult to go to sleep every night. It is a struggle every night. I'm sharing my story because I want other women to know that they're not alone, that it's okay to be scared, to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, and that it's never too late to get out, to seek help, to reclaim your life. Please be careful of who you match with and be careful who you go on dates with. I need to share this terrifying experience because I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, thinking about it. It wasn't just a bad date, it was something that felt genuinely wrong. It started innocently enough. I'd recently moved to a new city and was looking to meet people. A coworker suggested a local singles mixer at a bar downtown. I'm usually not one for those kinds of things, but I figured, what the hell, it couldn't hurt. That's where I met Joe. He was standing alone near the bar, nursing a drink. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He had this intense gaze that made me feel like he was really listening when I spoke, which was a welcome change from the usual small talk. We chatted for a while, and he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. He wasn't pushy or aggressive, just attentive. He asked about my job, my hobbies, my family. He even remembered details from earlier in the conversation, which impressed me. After an hour or so, he suggested we go somewhere quieter, maybe grab a bite to eat. I was having a good time, so I agreed. He led me to this small, dimly lit restaurant a few blocks away. It was tucked away on a side street, and I'd never noticed it before. The atmosphere was intimate, almost secretive. The waiter seated us at a secluded table in the back. The first part of the dinner was normal. We ordered food, talked about our favorite movies, and laughed at each other's jokes. But then the conversation took a turn. Joe started asking about my past relationships, specifically about the ones that had ended badly. He wanted to know all the details, what went wrong, who was at fault, how it made me feel. I hesitated to share too much, but he was so insistent, so empathetic that I eventually opened up. I told him about a particularly painful breakup I had gone through a few years ago. He listened intently, nodding and offering words of comfort. Then he asked a question that made my blood run cold. "Do you ever think about getting revenge on them?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I laughed nervously. "No, of course not," I said. "That's crazy." But he didn't laugh. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "But don't you think they deserve it?" he persisted. "After what they put you through?" I felt a growing sense of unease. "No," I said firmly. "Revenge is never the answer." He didn't say anything for a moment, just continued to stare at me. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a cold, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe not," he said softly, "but can be satisfying." The rest of the dinner was a blur. I tried to change the subject, but he kept bringing it back to the topic of revenge. He talked about different ways to get even, about making people pay for their mistakes. His words were becoming increasingly disturbing. I knew I had to get out of there. I made an excuse about having an early morning and said I needed to go home. He offered to walk me back to my apartment, but I declined, saying I wanted to take a taxi. He didn't argue. He just watched me leave, that unsettling smile still playing on his lips. I practically ran to the nearest taxi stand and gave the driver my address. As we drove away, I looked back at the restaurant. Joe was standing outside, watching me, his eyes like burning coals. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about his questions, his unsettling smile, the way he talked about revenge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I decided to do some research on Joe. I started with a simple Google search, but nothing came up. No social media profiles, no professional listings, nothing. It was like he didn't exist. That's when I got really scared. I started digging deeper, searching public records, court documents, anything I could find. And that's when I found it. An old news article about a man named Joe who had been arrested years ago for stalking and harassing his ex-girlfriend. The details of the case were disturbing. He had threatened her, vandalized her property, and even followed her across state lines. The article included a photo of Joe. It was older, but it was definitely him. My blood ran cold. I had gone on a date with a stalker. I immediately contacted the police and told them everything that had happened. They took my statement and said they would look into it, but they couldn't do much without more evidence. I spent the next few weeks living in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder. I changed my locks, installed a security system, and avoided going out alone. I was terrified that Joe would show up at my apartment. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when I heard a noise outside my window. It sounded like someone was tapping the glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly got out of bed and crept towards the window. I peeked through the curtains, and that's when I saw him. Joe was standing outside my apartment, staring up at my window, that unsettling smile on his face. I screamed and stumbled back, grabbing my phone and calling the police. They arrived within minutes, but Joe was gone. They searched the area, but they couldn't find him. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's house, too scared to go back to my apartment. I moved again a few weeks later, this time to a different city. I haven't seen Joe since, but I still think about him all the time. I'm always wary of new people I meet, always on the lookout for red flags. I need to share this terrifying experience because I want other people to be aware of the dangers of online dating. You never really know who you're talking to. It's important to be careful. Trust your instincts, and if something feels wrong, don't ignore it. Get out of there as fast as you can.